There is something in your blood that science cannot fully explain. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Inside your veins, there is a biological marker that researchers have been quietly puzzling over for more than a century. A marker that, according to the official record, did not exist in the same proportions among human beings before a very specific window of time. A marker whose sudden emergence across entire populations has been attributed to migration, to chance, to the slow drift of genetics across centuries. And yet, when you look at the numbers, the actual demographic data, the blood surveys, the epidemiological studies, something does not line up. Something is off in a way that feels less like a coincidence and more like a gap in a story that was never meant to be fully told. This is a documentary about blood, but it is also a documentary about memory, about what gets recorded and what gets erased, about a civilization that some researchers believe once spanned vast portions of the Eurasian continent, whose people left behind not only stone and architecture, but something far more intimate, a biological inheritance that may still circulate inside millions of people today, silently, invisibly, in the form of a blood type that the modern world only began cataloging in 1901. In the year 1901, an Austrian physician named Karl Landsteiner made a discovery that would change medicine forever. Working in a modest laboratory in Vienna, he observed that human blood could not always be mixed without catastrophic results. Some samples clotted. Some destroyed one another. After careful, methodical experimentation, he identified what we now call the ABO blood group system, a classification of human blood into types A, B, AB, and O, based on the presence or absence of specific antigens on the surface of red blood cells. For this discovery, Landsteiner would eventually receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1930. His work is rightly celebrated as one of the foundations of modern transfusion medicine. Millions of lives have been saved because of the system he described. But here is what is rarely discussed in classrooms or textbooks. When Landsteiner and his contemporaries began mapping blood types across different human populations in the early 20th century, they encountered a distribution that did not behave the way a truly ancient, evenly distributed genetic trait should behave. Certain blood types clustered in specific regions. Certain populations showed concentrations of particular types that seemed to appear in the historical record as if from nowhere. And the blood type that showed perhaps the most irregular and geographically concentrated distribution was type B. At the same time that these early blood surveys were being conducted, something else was happening in the historical record. A vast, sprawling chapter of Eurasian history was being quietly reorganized. Archives were being reclassified, maps were being redrawn, and an empire that certain 19th century historians had written about extensively, a civilization sometimes referred to as Tartaria or the Tartarian Empire, was being systematically reduced in mainstream scholarship to a footnote, a vague geographic label, a cartographic convenience that supposedly described nothing more than a loosely associated collection of nomadic tribes. These two stories, the story of blood typing and the story of Tartaria, seem on the surface entirely unrelated, but when you trace them carefully through the records, through the dates, through the papers of forgotten researchers and the marginalia of 19th century anthropologists, a pattern begins to emerge, a quiet, unsettling pattern that raises a question no official institution has ever formally addressed. Is it possible that what we call a blood type is also, in some cases, a record of a people, a biological memory of a civilization that the official history of the 20th century decided it could no longer afford to acknowledge? Let us begin with the geography. Because geography is where this story becomes impossible to dismiss. The ABO blood type system, once it began to be studied across populations in the early 1900s, revealed something remarkable. Blood type B, which today affects roughly 11% of the global population, was not distributed evenly across the world. Its highest concentrations were found in a specific geographic corridor. That corridor stretched from Eastern Europe through Central Asia, across the steppes of Siberia, and into the Indian subcontinent and parts of East Asia. In other words, it followed almost precisely the territory that 18th and 19th century European maps labeled as Great Tartary. This is not a fringe observation. It is documented in mainstream hematological research. A 1954 study published in the Annals of Human Genetics, authored by A. E. Morant and his colleagues, mapped ABO blood type frequencies across hundreds of populations globally. The B blood type map it produced is striking. The peak concentrations form what researchers have described as a geographic gradient, lowest in Western Europe, rising steadily as one moves east, reaching its highest concentrations in the populations of Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Morant himself noted this gradient with scholarly caution, attributing it to ancient migratory patterns and the movement of populations across the Eurasian steppe over thousands of years. This is the official explanation, and it is not without merit. Genetics does follow migration. Blood types do shift with population movement. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. Because the question of which population was moving and when is precisely the question that historians in the early 20th century were working very hard to reframe. In 1818, a German historian and linguist named Johann Gottfried Eichhorn referred in his writings to the Tartarian civilization as one of the great imperial traditions of the ancient world. He was not alone. Throughout the 17th, 18th, and into the early 19th century, European encyclopedias, atlases, and geographical treatises treated Tartaria as a distinct and significant civilization. The 1771 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the first edition ever published, contains a detailed entry on Tartary, describing it as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia to the north and west. It describes its inhabitants, their customs, their architecture, and their governance. The entry does not treat them as nomads, it treats them as a people. By the late 19th century, this characterization was changing. Tartaria was being gradually redefined in Western scholarship, not as a civilization with its own architecture, its own administrative traditions, its own genetic continuity, but as a geographic designation, a blank space, a label for lands that had not yet been absorbed into the expanding Russian Empire or the categorized territories of European colonial understanding. At the same time, something unusual was happening in the demographic records of Russia and Central Asia. The great census efforts of the late 19th century, particularly the Russian imperial census of 1897, the first comprehensive census ever conducted in the Russian Empire, were mapping populations across an enormous territory that had previously existed largely outside the reach of European record-keeping. What the census found, and what subsequent analyses of that data have noted, is a population distribution across the Eurasian steppe that did not fit neatly into the ethnic and racial taxonomies that European scholars of the time were attempting to impose upon it. People who did not match the official categories. Communities with their own architectural traditions, their own linguistic structures, their own physical characteristics, spread across territories that the official record was simultaneously classifying as empty or nomadic or historically insignificant. And then, in 1901, Karl Landsteiner names the blood types, and the mapping begins. Here is where the official explanation begins to develop its cracks. The mainstream scientific position on blood type distribution is that the ABO system is ancient, far older than any historical civilization, developed over tens of thousands of years of human evolution and migration. Under this model, the concentration of type B blood in Central Asia reflects migration patterns from the deep prehistoric past, not from any civilization that existed within recorded history. This is a reasonable position, but it contains an assumption that is worth examining. It assumes that blood type frequencies across populations have remained relatively stable over the past several thousand years, and that assumption is not as secure as it might seem. A 2012 paper published in the journal Human Genetics examining ancient DNA extracted from European skeletal remains spanning thousands of years found that blood type distributions in prehistoric European populations were significantly different from those seen in modern Europeans. The researchers concluded that major population replacements had occurred, events in which large portions of a region's genetic heritage were essentially overwritten by incoming populations. Population replacement is not a fringe concept. It is now well established in ancient DNA research. What is less discussed is how recently such replacements may have occurred and under what circumstances. Because here is the anomaly that sits at the center of this story. If you examine the demographic data from Central Asia and the territories formerly labeled as Great Tartary from the late 19th century onward, you see something unusual in the population records. Communities that had been documented in earlier records by Russian explorers, by Jesuit missionaries, by the trading companies that crossed the Eurasian steppe appear in later records reduced, reclassified, or recorded under different ethnic designations. The people are sometimes still there, but they have been given new names, new categories, new origins. And the blood type data, which begins to be collected in the early 20th century, finds exactly the kind of distribution you would expect to find if a large, geographically concentrated population had recently been dispersed, their highest frequencies lingering in the regions where they were most densely settled, decreasing as you move outward toward the periphery. Witness accounts. There is a letter written in 1887 by a Russian ethnographer named Nikolai Yadrintsev, who spent years traveling and documenting the peoples of Siberia and Central Asia. Yadrintsev was not a romantic or a fantasist. He was a systematic observer who published in established academic journals. In his correspondence with colleagues at the Imperial Russian Geographical Society, he described repeatedly encountering communities in the interior of the continent, whose oral traditions, architectural remnants, and physical characteristics did not correspond to the official categories being applied to them by the expanding Russian imperial administration. In one letter, he writes, and I am paraphrasing from the Russian, the original held in the archives of the Geographical Society in St. Petersburg, that the people he encountered along certain river valleys in western Siberia spoke of ancestors who had built permanent settlements of considerable size, whose descendants had been scattered by events they described only in fragments, in the way that people describe events too large and too recent to speak about directly. Too recent. Not ancient memory, recent memory, wrapped in the language of legend because direct language had become dangerous. There is also the diary of Father Innocentius Venianovin, a Russian Orthodox missionary who traveled extensively through Siberia in the 1820s and 1830s and was later canonized as a saint by the Russian Orthodox Church. In his private diary, held at the Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg, Veniaminov records encountering communities whose origins he could not reconcile with the official histories he had been given. He notes, in an entry from 1831, that certain populations he encountered in the interior showed physical characteristics. He uses the word constitución, borrowing from Latin, that he had not seen documented in any of the ethnographic literature available to him. We do not know exactly what he meant by this. The diary entries are fragmentary. Some pages have been removed, whether by time or by intent, no one can say for certain. And then there are the oral traditions themselves. Collected in fragments by researchers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries from communities across the Kazakh steppe, the Altai region, and the Siberian interior, these traditions contain a recurring motif: the memory of a great civilization that existed before the current order of the world. A civilization that was not destroyed by natural disaster or by military conquest in the conventional sense, but by something more methodical: a reorganization, a renaming, a slow administrative erasure that took generations to complete. What would it mean if all of this were connected? Let us consider the possibility carefully, without reaching for certainties we cannot support. There is a theory, held by a small but serious community of researchers at the intersection of historical linguistics, population genetics, and revisionist historiography, that what we call the Tartarian civilization was not simply a geographic label, but a description of a real, sophisticated, and far-reaching culture that dominated large portions of the Eurasian continent from the medieval period through approximately the 18th century. Under this theory, the administrative dismantling of this civilization, through the expansion of the Russian Empire to the east, through the consolidation of European colonial categories, and through the systematic reclassification of its peoples and records in the 19th century, was not incidental. It was deliberate. A process of historical overwriting so thorough that within a few generations the populations themselves had largely lost access to the institutional memory of what they had been. If this is true, then the blood type distribution of type B across the Eurasian corridor is not merely an artifact of prehistoric migration, it is a fingerprint, a biological record of a people who were reclassified but not erased, whose DNA persisted even when their archives were reorganized, their cities reattributed, and their descendants given new names. The pattern becomes even more suggestive when you consider one additional data point: the blood type AB, the rarest of the four major types, present in only about 4% of the global population, was described by Karl Landsteiner and his colleagues in their earliest papers as the most recently emerged of the blood groups. Landsteiner himself, in a 1927 paper, noted that AB appeared to be the result of admixture between A and B populations, a biological marker of contact and mixing between distinct genetic communities. The geographic distribution of AB blood follows a specific pattern. It is concentrated, again, in precisely the regions where the B gradient is highest: Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, parts of Eastern Europe, but it appears at elevated frequencies in populations that the historical record describes as having been displaced, relocated, or administratively reorganized in the 18th and 19th centuries. Admixture, contact, reorganization, these are the words that appear again and again in both the genetic literature and the historical record, applied to the same geographic corridor during the same window of time. Perhaps it is a coincidence. Perhaps the genetics and the history simply happen to rhyme, in the way that all complex patterns occasionally produce false harmonies. Or perhaps the blood is telling a story that the archives were not permitted to finish. We began this documentary with a simple observation: there is something in your blood that science cannot fully explain. That statement is still true. The distribution of blood types across human populations remains, in the careful language of population geneticists, not fully resolved. The models that seek to explain it require assumptions about ancient migration, about the timing of population expansions, about the stability of genetic frequencies over time. Assumptions that are reasonable but not certain, assumptions that leave room, if only a small room, for other explanations. What would it mean if the official history of the 19th and 20th centuries had overwritten something real, not invented a complete fiction? History is never that clean, but reframed, reclassified, and gradually deprioritized a civilization whose descendants are still here, still living, still carrying in their blood a marker whose geographic distribution quietly mirrors the borders of a world that official scholarship has spent more than a century teaching us to see as imaginary. We do not know what Tartaria truly was. The honest answer is that the evidence is fragmentary, contested, and complicated by the very processes that some researchers believe were designed to make it fragmentary, contested, and complicated. The maps are real, the encyclopedias are real, the blood type gradient is real, the demographic anomalies in the 19th century census records are real. What they mean, taken together, that is the question that remains open. There is a particular kind of forgetting that is not accidental. It happens slowly, administratively, through reclassification and renaming, and the quiet removal of pages from archives that most people will never visit. It happens in the generation that witnesses the change and chooses silence, and in the generation after that which inherits the silence without inheriting the reason for it. And by the third generation, the silence feels like the natural state of things, like there was never anything else to remember. But the blood does not forget. The body does not reclassify. Whatever happened in those interior territories in the 18th and 19th centuries, whatever reorganization of peoples and records and institutional memory was carried out across the vast corridor between Eastern Europe and the Pacific, the biological inheritance of it is still present, still measurable, still mapping itself quietly onto the surface of human red blood cells in a pattern that follows borders that have not existed on any official map for over a century. Maybe the genetics are simply ancient. Maybe the B blood type gradient is nothing more than the residue of migrations that happened 10,000 years before any civilization we have a name for. Maybe Tartaria was always a label and never a people. Maybe the missionaries and ethnographers and explorers who wrote about what they found in the interior were simply confused or romantic or writing for audiences who wanted to believe in lost worlds. Maybe the removed pages from Veniaminov's diary fell out on their own. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of administrative coincidences, repeated across a century, across a continent, across the records of a people who happened to live in the wrong place at the moment when the modern world was deciding which histories were worth keeping. The question is not whether they erased it, the question is why they thought they had to.